another episode of DWP 2022. Our theme this season, whoever controls Africa runs the world. It follows, therefore, that Africa that controls Africa is the next undisputed superpower in this world after the US and China. So the topic today is why they stop Africa from manufacturing. So we're going to go through the first segment, just giving the facts. We would like always to share as many facts as possible because we Africans love our continent. We think we know the continent, but we never really do enough to understand the facts. So those foreigners bent on controlling Africa end up knowing more facts about Africa than we do. So facts first. We also always do a sankofa, meaning looking back as far as possible so that we can see furthest when we go forward. We look back to fetch what we have forgotten as Africans. We look back to fetch the wholesome things that we're leaving behind. So after the facts, the second segment, we then do the interpretation of that, citing as many other people as possible. And then we go into conclusions and way forward. So in the last episode, we discussed and gave the facts around this ridiculous situation where Africa is the poorest and yet wealthiest continent in the world. We discussed how Africa is the major benefactor or creditor to the rest of the world to the tune of $100 billion equivalent a year of resources that are siphoned out of Africa. Unfortunately for Africans, we're still kind of sleepwalking into the future, not realizing that the time is now when the scramble for Africa, when the third wave, is a lot easier for us to fight and re-win the control of Africa and therefore the rest of the world. So what are the facts around Africa not manufacturing enough and actually why the rest of the industrialized world, both East and West, would like to ensure that Africa does not manufacture and remains poor? The facts are as follows. Number one, if you go back to the 1970s, Africa was manufacturing 3% average of world output in manufacturing. Today, that figure has gone down to 1.5%. So Africa is actually de-industrialized over 50 years, in spite of the fact that it was never really that industrialized at all. And if you look at our national accounts in Africa, and then we aggregate them, the contribution of manufacturing to our GDP is also been going down. You will recall that around about the year 2000, Africa's economic growth rates, as measured using Western systems, started to grow actually at quite reasonable rates. And for a decade, until about 2010, Africa had the world record in economic growth rates. But what we did not do as Africans was to realize that this growth was not contributing to manufacturing at all. In fact, it was resource export driven, mainly because China was the fastest growing manufacturing giant in the world and was importing a lot of African raw materials. And in spite of the fact that Africa received reasonable resources exporting to China, we never use those resources to then ensure that we are manufacturing our own raw materials. We put in place serious strategies for manufacturing. Instead, we just started increasing salaries of civil servants and so on and so forth. So the Africa Rising story in the first decade of 2000 was kind of a red herring. It actually fueled this harmful pattern of commodity-driven boom and bust that has repeated itself in Africa for a long time. So let's dig deeper into the facts. Let's look at the major imported products in Africa. About 25% of imports in Africa are manufactured items of machinery, vehicles, and other types of equipment. Another 25% or so is importation of other finished goods, manufactured goods, a lot of which we could manufacture ourselves. I mean, we are importing ridiculous items, such as toothpicks. There's a ridiculous story which we have to show on this series, where in Kenya, KFC, the junk food giant, not only imports chickens to Kenya, but also imports potatoes, because it won't buy from the local farmers. That's how ridiculous we have gone in terms of the items we are importing.
Global fast food chain KFC says it will soon be sourcing its potatoes from Kenyan farmers, provided they meet global KFC quality and safety standards. The company made the announcement after coming under fire from Kenyans who are angered by its decision to stick to imported potatoes amid a shortage, despite the availability of the produce from local growers.
We still import at least 14% of our major import items are food items, and we're going to talk about that a bit more in a minute. If you look at how much food Africa imports, this figure varies between 40 to 50 billion US dollars equivalent per annum over the last few decades. 40, 50 billion dollars importing food. If you realize that the total aid from industrialized countries to Africa is less than $40 billion, you then realize that Africans have enough cash. I mean, when we pay $50 billion a year to import food, including junk food, we are paying cash. That's not credit, those are not loans. We're talking about cash imports, which means that Africans have enough cash to sponsor our own manufacturing of our own foods and to sponsor our own industrial strategy. So it's important to realize that the industrialized world, East and West, would love to ensure that Africa remains where it is, not manufacturing much, and still in poverty. So there are other details around Africa's export and import shares from various parts of the world, which we are going to share in the PowerPoint, just to show the ridiculousness of the extent to which Africa is not manufacturing and is importing unnecessary items. So I'll just take Africa's exports to Africa just as an example, just one country, the United States. 37% on average of US exports to Africa is wheat. So can you imagine? I'm just focused on the US here. There is another ridiculous figure, which I don't have on the tip of my hands now. A ridiculous amount of imports of rice from Asia. So So we are addicted to wheat products from the West because wheat does not grow in Africa. We import. We're addicted to wheat products, bread, and so on, to the extent that in some West African countries, they import bread from France, can you imagine? But it's still an addiction, whether it's rice, which we don't grow much in Africa as well, or wheat items. It's still just starch. It's not that it tastes better. You're just addicted to it. It's just an addiction. You could be equally addicted to sorghum, millets, maize, teff, cassava. We should be making our bread from those items and addict ourselves with our own starch. But ridiculous amounts of imports. We import from the US, 23% of the imports from the US is poultry products. Chickens, can you imagine? We're importing chickens from the United States. Of course, we also import from Europe and other places. There was a time Brazil was dumping their own, junk chicken products to Africa. So it's just mind-boggling. Africa has 60% of the entire world's arable land. Why do we have to import grains? Why do we have to import wheat? We don't need to be addicted to wheat products. We don't need to be addicted to rice products. So, like I say, there's this ridiculous story that is kind of doing its rounds on the social media, where this young girl in Kenya is just amazed at how we, the older generation, are so ridiculously out of line. We allow KFC, the global junk food giant, to import not just the chickens into Kenya, but also the potatoes, and cite all ridiculous standards that the Kenyan farmers are not able to meet. Potatoes, that's even importing water. Potatoes are 80% water. So, this is the situation we are faced with. And then even the small amount of manufacturing that we're doing, you see there is a gradual increase in the rate of foreign direct investment into Africa's manufacturing sector. So they decide what they really want to manufacture for us in Africa. In some instances, for the local market, in some instances, to export back to themselves. So, in summary here, Africa is even importing manufacturers as if we can't create our own manufacturers. So, look at the statistics for ourselves and look at the rate at which Africa's growth rate in manufacturing has declined over 50 years, and look at the contribution that the manufacturing sector continues to fail to make within the overall economic growth rate. In this session today, we are not really focused on the manufacturing sector itself, which we will do in future sessions. Rather, we're just juxtaposing this issue of the rest of the world thinking around where Africa's manufacturing should go so that they protect their interests and keep Africa poor, and our own ability to analyze our situation and then take bold strategic decisions. So that's what we're doing today. And when we come back into the second segment, we go right into that. Thank you. So welcome back to the second segment where we look at, so what does all this mean for us? So if we start by looking at the period just after 2000, as Africa was going through the so-called Africa Rising boom, Had African leaders actually heeded the advice from experts that these profits that were being pumped into Africa from commodity boom could have been used to stimulate manufacturing companies. Actually, the results today would be different, but we didn't do that. So if you fast forward, you go back, you see in 2016, a meeting was held in Addis Ababa, early 2016, eventually led to the launch of the economic report on Africa 2016 by ECA on greening Africa's industrialization. The conclusion of that meeting in 2016 was clear. Africa needs bold policy moves if it's going to be an industrial giant. And during the discussions at that meeting in 2016, it was agreed by the experts that the main reason why Africa's slow industrialization persists is because our leaders have failed to pursue bold economic policies, and mostly because of the fear of antagonizing donors who would want Africa to actually stay focused on trade relations with them rather than on pursuing their own manufacturing. So experts at that meeting had a lot to say that I would like to share with you for those who have not gone through those reports.
The 35th AU Heads of State and Governments meeting being held here in Ethiopia's capital Addis Ababa brought together leaders from across the continent to discuss critical issues affecting the continent. Africa remains poorly represented in the powerful UN Security Council.
The thing is, and it's been like this for a long time. It's not just like our leaders are out there to sell us out to the West. We are all been put in the corner. All leaders at all levels, not just our political leaders. All leaders. Our scholars and analysts, same problem. You know, you go to our religions, they are owned. Mindset is very much worshiping the Western world. And the whole idea behind this push to get Africa to remain where it is to get us to focus on foreign investment flows, the so-called international community that's driving the agenda for Africa, from London, Paris, New York, and so on. They are focused on, hey, Africans, make Africa attractive for us to come and do it for you. You know, they would want to see more foreign investment flows into Africa rather than Africa investing in its own manufacturing. So by focusing on foreign investment, making Africa attractive for foreign investors, all we are doing is inviting resource extraction industries, and then they build modern shopping malls to sell their own manufactured goods and finished goods to us. So Africans in that 2016 meeting, African experts had a lot to say, and actually trying to make it clear that African leaders, African intellectuals, have to reject this misleading notion that one day Africa will join the manufactured world in the East and West by postponing our own industrial society strategies. Somehow we're going to be there without first building our own industrial capacity. So there is lack of policy imagination. There is lack of boldness and courage to take bold economic changes like the Asian tigers have managed to do. So Africa really needs that self-confidence to develop those alternative policies, and forget about this myth of free trade that is peddled by the Bretton Woods institutions, World Bank, IMF, because preaching free market and free trade to poor countries by industrial countries is just to capture larger shares of Africa's markets and to preempt the emergence of possible competitors and ensure that African manufacturers will never compete with the existing G40 countries. So we have a lot to learn from Asia's development efforts in industrializing themselves. State-led development policies, the so-called developmental state approach, has worked when there's serious focus in transforming an agrarian economy into a manufacturing industrial society. And that's what Africans really need to focus on. If I quote Carlos Lopez, who was with the UN ECA then, that meeting, he said, all countries that have industrialized started with degrees of protectionism themselves. Now the same countries tell Africa not to protect their infant industries. But then when you look at the facts, it is the industrialized countries who are more protectionist than the poorer countries. You just have to look at even the WTO, who normally just run at the whims of the industrialized world, have recently published facts to show that there's been an increase in trade restrictive measures and protectionism by the G20 groups. In fact, there's a WTO report which shows that of recent, the G20 economies have slapped at least 145 new trade restrictive measures over the last couple of years. You know, it is actually the industrialized countries who are protectionist. Some scholars have also argued that classifying Africa just generically as a late industrializing nation is inaccurate. Rather, Africa is best characterized as a case of interrupted industrial growth. So, in conclusion, that is the interpretation of the facts that show that the industrialized world is doing its best to stop Africa from manufacturing and stay poor. We'll be back with the conclusion shortly. Thank you. So the main conclusion on today's topic is simply that the global system as a whole is designed to keep Africa poor, keep it where it is without being a manufacturing giant. They want Africa to continue its supplier of cheap raw materials to themselves and to be a big market for themselves where Africa consumes foreign manufactured goods. And then the so-called international community as a whole, the Bretton Woods institutions, World Bank, IMF, you know, the entire United Nations system, which I have a lot of respect for, but because they don't have their own resources, are also captive to the machinations of the it's called donor countries. The aid industry as a whole, or development assistance, is designed around this ideology that you, Africa, stay where you are. In any case, you are poor because it's your fault you're poor. Africans don't collectively have enough of the Sankofa understanding of who we are and where we come from. And therefore why we cannot, we don't redo history, we don't reinvent history, but we create new history by understanding how we ended up in the situation we are in and then look as far forward as possible. That's all I'm saying. But right now, we fall into this ideology. Our mindset, subliminally, we kind of believe that we are poor because it's our fault, or entirely our fault. It's only our fault to the extent that we are the only ones who can take ourselves out, but it's not our fault that Africa's resources have been plundered around the 3 scrambles for Africa that we discussed in the last session. So the whole idea is to distract Africans from the real issue of controlling Africa and African resources. So must watch other analysts and commentators such as Dr. Arikana, who explains it so beautiful. She explains how they keep distracting us so that we focus on trivial things, making those issues look so important. We got political independence from the colonial masters, but it's just cosmetic, because the real independence will come when we are economically independent.
Why is it that we get coffee and tea from Switzerland? Have you seen the large coffee fields in Switzerland? A good portion of that is coming from our beloved continent. Why are these countries allowed to get away with relabeling African products as their own? It's all by design.
So they have to keep Africa poor in order to continue running the world. The colonial masters want Africa to remain poor because that's a way to keep the tables turned economically against Africa. So, and for US and China, they want to keep Africa where it is because they want to run the world. They are the 2 superpowers competing for who is going to run the world next. So the rivalry between US and China is just a proxy war to who is going to run the world. And next week, we'll discuss that particular issue and its implications for Africa. We want to look at, so who needs who, and what really do we understand from the Western approach and the Chinese approach. But for now, the main conclusion is that their strategy is to continue accessing Africa's vast resources for a song. And they've hardwired their institutions, such as the WTO, to make it difficult for Africa to manufacture, and make it difficult for African farmers to compete with European and American farmers. They want to continue to extract the raw materials, and for Africa to remain reliant on exportation of raw materials whilst they manufacture and continue to grow. So listen to the other commentators that we're going to share with you. The other thing I'd like to put on the table now is just the fixation on poverty that the international community, so-called, has managed to put in our subconscious mind. Their whole development assistance institution has been focused on poverty reduction for the last 2 to 3 decades. I mean, Africans don't need poverty reductions, and Africans know that. They only go along with that song because they have to appease the donors. What Africans really need is wealth creation. I mean, Africans know they're not poor. I mean, I grew up in the village, didn't know I was poor until I was a university student. When somebody says, oh, you're from the rural areas, so you're poor, because we've been told by Western educational system, you're poor. When I grew up, I definitely never felt poor. I didn't need to be a European to feel that I was in a fully functional society. So this whole idea of poverty reduction falls into a well-known universal law of attraction. Whatever you focus on is what you attract. So the world development assistance industry is consumed with poverty reduction, consumed with poverty to the extent that they unwittingly, or even wittingly at times, they actually then manufacture more poverty and more dependency. So at best, this whole institution is a tragedy of good intentions, but at worst, it is actually a machinery to blame the victim and set the victim up for even further exploitation, extended exploitation. So the industrialized countries have to keep the knee firmly on Africa's economy, on Africa's manufacturing sector, so that it doesn't grow. So listen to Jeffrey Sachs and how he exposes the truth on how the Western world is keeping Africa poor. Listen to the primary reasoning there. It's very powerful.
It's interesting, we heard from the Minister of DRC, what's wrong with your country? Well, we don't even start by saying the King of Belgium created a slave colony for 30 years. The government of Belgium ran the slave colony for another 40 years. The CIA assassinated your first popular leader, Mr. Lumumba, and then installed another dictatorship for the next 30 years. And then Glencore and others now suck out your cobalt without giving you tax income.
So suffices to say for now that one has just got to look across the seas to Asia and see and learn from what the Asian tigers have achieved over the last couple of decades. It's phenomenal. It is self-evident that the Asian tigers' superior economic development lies squarely in local investment. My first time to China in the mid-90s, and I attended a seminar where in the presentation, the Chinese official was explaining two facts. One, China had, even at that time, had the largest domestic savings of any country. And yet, at the same time, China had the largest foreign direct investment ever. So for me, as an African who is used to being told by these development assistance institutions that Africans, it's our fault, we don't attract enough FDI, etc. I then ask the question, but why do you need all the foreign direct investment if you got the world's largest domestic savings? So the response I got was, well, that's the problem with you Africans. We in China have enough resources to sponsor all our development. But we need foreign direct investment, not for the cash. We need it, number one, to attract the best, newest technology so that it comes in voluntarily. We also need it so that we can negotiate the world markets, because you can't come to China and invest in manufacturing sneakers or whatever and then not negotiate where you export those products beyond the Chinese market. Let's share those markets. And thirdly, to create quality jobs. Cash is number 4 on the list. We don't need the cash. But you see, in Africa, all we want is cash. The same investors, so-called, including China itself, who come to us, and the first thing we need is the cash. Never mind the technology, never mind the markets, the world markets, never mind quality jobs. We get the cash, we spend the cash in 6 months, it's over, we continue to sell other assets from the continent. So we have a lot to learn from the Asian tigers. It's very clear that local investment, local domestic savings and investment is the key. Foreign aid will never be the answer to Africa's manufacturing requirements. Foreign aid and local manufacturing don't go hand in hand. Foreign aid, for instance, food aid, has had the effect of actually destroying local agriculture and actually serving and benefiting European and American agribusinesses, which are vastly overproducing in their own countries because they are heavily subsidized by their governments. So historically, food aid has nothing to do with loving Africans. They don't love you, please. It's more to do with just getting rid of the excess supplies that they get from their farmers whom they are subsidizing. When that food aid comes to Africa, it becomes a deterrent for local markets. It becomes a deterrent for local manufacturing. It becomes a deterrent to local development. So as I conclude, I want to go back to one other important contextual aspects to these conclusions I'm making. And that is to say, every single African country, the 55 of our countries, every single one is either in a low income trap or a middle income trap. And there's no way out of that trap without some bold economic policy measures to dissolve the dual economy, to dissolve this economy where the vast majority of people don't participate in the industrial processes. The vast majority of small farmers have to be the suppliers of raw materials to factories and to supermarkets and wholesalers. So the whole idea of industrialization is about getting the majority of people in the rural setting to mass produce and mass supply the raw materials. Everyone getting sucked into the industrial processes, knowing fully well where these products are ending up, in which factories, and then mass processing of these products. And more importantly, then mass consuming of our own goods and services before we worry about exports. That's the context in which we're going to be arguing in future sessions that the manufacturing sector has to be built around. Instead of this addiction and slavery to so-called investor-friendly policies, meaning getting friendly and more friendly to investors who come and completely just siphon and exploit their raw materials, and at the same time they bring manufactured goods. And you know, when you look at the nature of foreign direct investment into manufacturing, a large chunk of it are foreigners coming to manufacture in our own countries. So we're even importing manufacturers. Sometimes they even bring their own labor, you know. So I mean, it's really a wake-up call here. I mean, we must look at the facts. We must analyze without emotion. We must know that we are on economic liberators. We have a lot to learn from the Asian tiger books over the last couple of decades. The developmental state model, really when you have the state squarely focused on massive transformation of the economy and working hand in hand with the business sector and society at large, mastering the art and science of building industrial processes, industrial transformation. That's the way to go for Africa. So in future episodes, we will focus on those models and how scholars and thinkers and ourselves see see how those Asian models can be adapted to be more relevant and applicable to the African situation. We will also focus on the African Continental Free Trade Area, which was launched in March 2018. But a single market for goods and services in Africa is just incredible. Just imagine, by 2025, Africa with 1.5 billion population, the largest population in the world, and a single market. That alone tells you we'll be bigger than China. Because China is 1.3 billion or so, almost 1.4, in a much smaller space with far less resources than Africa. That's all you need to focus on for now, to realize that the move from an Africa which is the poorest continent, yet the wealthiest. So if we have 60% of the world's arable land and the largest deposits of most non-minerals in the world, and the largest population, a single market just means we can grow 10 times bigger than China will ever be able to grow, or the United States. So we'll be focused on how the manufacturing sector unlocks all that as Africa now drives for being the next economic superpower with sustained growth, jobs, and once again, it is important for us, and in the next segment we will discuss who needs who really. How far, to what extent does Africa need the rest of the world to develop? And vice versa. What extent to which the rest of the world really need Africa? We need to discuss that so that we can locate the rivalry between US and China in terms of what it means for us. We have to learn from both sides. We have to be smart about it and less emotional. We have to understand their strategies and translate them into our own strategy. So in conclusion, whoever controls Africa runs the world, which means, therefore, an Africa that controls Africa will be the unquestionable, undisputed future global economic superpower after US and China are done. But this is only possible when Africa takes bold policies, bold economic measures to industrialize through local savings and investment, as opposed to thinking foreign direct investment will do it. It won't. Africa, therefore, can definitely, within 6 to 10 years of pursuing proper agricultural policies which lead to industrial growth, within 6 to 10 years, if we look at China did it in 6 years, from 1980 to 1986. Africa can do it equally fast because we know now how to do it. That will then mean in the first 6 to 10 years, we will still be far from being the world's industrial hub, but we will be, by that time, the world's bread basket. With 60% of arable land in the world, with the largest population, with a population now understanding how to mass produce using small farmers, mass produce raw materials. We don't need big farms. Economics that we learn at school misleads us. Economies of scale does not mean economies of size. A few large farms producing masses of raw material for factories. Economies of scale, as opposed to economies of size, mean millions, thousands of small farmers producing and aggregating product into mass production into factories. Africa will definitely be the world's bread basket in the next 6 to 10 years if we follow those principles. Bread basket, we won't be the industrial giant yet. It will take another 20, 30 years. But we'll be exporting not raw materials, manufactured foods to the rest of the world. Except that we won't be exporting junk like they do to us. We'll be exporting healthier foods, which are tastier. That's what Africa is known for. So see you in the next session. Thank you very much.